A waitress was fired on the spot, simply because she dared to speak the truth. The entire cafe turned its back on her, leaving her standing there, alone, drowning in a sea of loss and disappointment. In that moment, she thought she had lost everything. Her job, her sense of belonging, the very place she had once considered her second home. But just 24 hours later, the unthinkable happened. A familiar face walked through the cafe doors once again. This time, he wasn't just another customer. He carried with him an offer so unexpected, so life-changing, that no one in their right mind could refuse. What really happened that night? And how could a single moment, one fleeting decision, completely alter the course of her life forever? Jada, 28 years old, was a waitress at a small cafe called Maple's Corner. To outsiders, it was nothing more than an unremarkable cafe, a place that wouldn't even make it onto the city's map. But to the regulars, Maple's Corner was a place woven into the fabric of their lives. It was where elderly patrons gathered every morning to read the newspaper, where conversations echoed through the walls day after day, year after year. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, moving at a different pace from the rest of the world. For Jada, this place was more than just a job. She wasn't just serving coffee, she was part of the stories that lived here. She knew Mr. Carl preferred his Americano black, no sugar. Mrs. Margaret always ordered Earl Grey tea. And Frank, the outspoken older gentleman who loved a good debate, insisted that his coffee be served piping hot, almost scalding. 4 years of working here, and she had memorized every rhythm of this cafe. Everything was familiar, safe, unchanging. But tonight, everything would be different. The bell above the door chimed. Jada lifted her head, ready to greet the new arrival like she did every day. But the moment her eyes landed on the figure that had just walked in, she froze. The man walked in, carrying an aura that was impossible to mistake. He wasn't dressed in an expensive suit. There were no bodyguards, no entourage trailing behind him. Just a simple gray coat, a face that carried the weight of exhaustion, and a slow, contemplative stride. And yet, despite the lack of words, the entire cafe fell into an eerie silence. No one had to say a thing. Everyone instinctively knew that this was not an ordinary customer. Elon Musk. A name the entire world knew. One of the wealthiest, most powerful men on the planet. But what was he doing here? Why would a billionaire, a man who ran multiple global corporations, walk into a small, unremarkable cafe, one so modest that it didn't even have a proper online listing? The whispers started. Curious glances darted toward him, filled with both intrigue and skepticism. Jada could feel the tension slowly spreading through the air, creeping into the once peaceful atmosphere of the cafe. But no matter how surreal this moment felt, she still had a job to do. She took a deep breath, forced herself to remain calm, and stepped forward, even though her heart was pounding harder than usual. Jada stopped in front of the table, inhaling deeply to steady herself. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" Elon Musk lifted his head, and the moment their eyes met, Jada noticed something she never expected. His eyes, they weren't the same as the ones she had seen countless times on television. They weren't piercing with intensity. They weren't filled with an overbearing confidence that made others feel small in comparison. Instead, they were tired. The kind of exhaustion that didn't just come from long hours or sleepless nights. The exhaustion of a man who carried too much weight on his shoulders. A man who wasn't just running billion-dollar companies, but also constantly facing criticism, scrutiny, and even hatred from those who would never truly understand him. At this moment, in Maple's Corner, he wasn't the visionary CEO. He wasn't the controversial billionaire making headlines. Right now, he was just a man who needed a moment of peace. Just a black coffee, his voice was low, unhurried, and a slice of apple pie if you have any. Jada nodded. "Of course, I'll bring that right out." She turned and walked back toward the counter. But her heart was still racing. Not because she was nervous, not because she was serving Elon Musk, but because she knew tonight would be different. "Are you Elon Musk?" A deep, gruff voice cut through the tense silence. Jada froze mid-step, her body instinctively tensing. She slowly turned her head toward the source of the voice. It was Frank. The older man folded his newspaper, set it down on the table, and crossed his arms over his chest. His sharp, scrutinizing gaze locked onto Elon, studying him with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. Elon met his eyes with calm composure, his face unreadable. "Yes, I am." Frank tilted his head slightly, his expression hardening. "I remember you were one of the early backers of OpenAI, funded them, supported them. And now what? You turned your back on them, sued them, and started your own AI company?" He let the words linger for a moment before continuing, his voice carrying a distinct note of skepticism. "Tell me, are you trying to control everything?" A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the cafe. Jada flicked her gaze toward Elon, waiting to see how he would respond. His expression remained neutral, but she caught a fleeting moment of deep contemplation in his eyes, as if he had heard this question 1,000 times before, yet still felt its weight. "I'm not trying to control everything," Elon said at last, his voice steady but deliberate. "I simply believe that AI must be transparent, truthful, and free from hidden agendas." Frank let out a short, dry laugh. "That's a nice sentiment," he scoffed. "But from what I see, the real reason you started your own AI company is that you lost control over OpenAI. You didn't get to pull the strings the way you wanted, so now you're building your own empire." He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Another billionaire with an ego too big for his own good. The murmurs grew louder. Some patrons nodded in agreement, a few exchanged knowing glances, while others simply observed the unfolding confrontation in silence. Jada felt her chest tighten with frustration. It wasn't about whether she agreed with Elon Musk or not. It was the way Frank spoke, as if he knew everything, as if the entire story could be boiled down to a simple tale of greed and power. As if someone like Elon Musk, someone who had pushed the boundaries of technology and space exploration, could be so easily dismissed. A spark of indignation flickered inside her, and as the tension in the cafe continued to build, Jada knew she had a choice. She could stay quiet, or she could speak up. She took a deep breath, then, without thinking, spoke. "Frank." Every head in the cafe turned toward her. Jada had never stepped into debates like this before. She had always kept her thoughts to herself, choosing to stay neutral, to avoid conflict. But tonight, she couldn't stay silent. "You really think Elon Musk does everything just for power?" Her voice was firm, unwavering. She scanned the room, making eye contact with the regulars, challenging them to think beyond what they assumed to be true. "Then what about Tesla? What about clean energy? What about SpaceX, the advancements in space exploration? What about the medical research he's funded? Are you saying all of that was just personal ambition?" No one answered. The cafe was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jada wasn't naive. She knew Musk was controversial. She knew not everyone agreed with him, and maybe some of the criticisms were valid. But to reduce everything he had done to a simple narrative of greed, to ignore the impact of his work entirely, that was unfair. She took a step forward, her voice carrying through the hushed space. "We don't have to agree with everything he does," she said, her tone firm but controlled. "But is it fair to erase all of his contributions? To pretend none of it matters?" She turned back toward Elon. He said nothing, but his eyes, once guarded, once distant, now held something different. A flicker of recognition, a quiet moment of appreciation. But just as she was beginning to process what she had done, another voice cut through the silence. "Jada," she stiffened. The voice was familiar. She turned around. It was her boss, Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith stepped out from behind the counter. His expression wasn't angry, but the usual warmth he carried, gone. "We don't have debates like this here." His voice was calm, measured. Jada pressed her lips together. "But I wasn't." He cut her off. "This cafe is not a place for you to defend billionaires." A chill ran down her spine, because that wasn't what she had been doing. She wasn't defending a billionaire. She was defending the truth. But that didn't matter, because in the next breath, Mr. Smith exhaled, his tone final. "You're not a good fit for this cafe anymore." Jada was fired, right there, on the spot. The reality of it sank in slowly, like ice settling in her veins. She looked around, desperately searching for a familiar face, for just one person who might stand up for her. But she found no one. Not Mrs. Margaret, not Mr. Carl, not even the people she had served every single day for the last 4 years. Her heart clenched, A crushing, suffocating weight pressed against her chest. And then she turned back toward Elon Musk. He was watching her, still silent, still unwritable. But in his eyes, she saw something that no one else in the cafe had given her: understanding. And somehow, she knew this was only the beginning. Jada slowly untied her apron, her fingers trembling slightly as she set it down on the counter. A deep sense of loss settled in her chest, heavy and suffocating. She didn't regret what she had said, but the sting of being fired, right here, in front of everyone, was sharper than she had expected. Not a single person spoke up for her. Not a single person objected to Mr. Smith's decision. The people she had served every single day, the regulars she had come to know like family, the ones who had laughed with her, shared their stories, their routines, all of them remained silent. Heads lowered, eyes averted. Jada swallowed hard, turned away, and took a step toward the door. Her hand reached for the doorknob, but just as her fingers brushed against the cool metal, a deep, commanding voice broke through the tense silence behind her. "Wait." The entire cafe froze. Every conversation, every movement came to an abrupt halt. All eyes snapped toward the one who had spoken. Elon Musk. Elon rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate, his presence commanding even in the absence of force. His face remained composed, but there was something sharper in his gaze now, something that cut through the air like a blade. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his wallet, extracted a large bill, and placed it on the table. But his focus wasn't on the money. His eyes were locked onto Mr. Smith. "So, in this place, employees aren't allowed to express their opinions?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that filled the entire room. Mr. Smith blinked, clearly taken aback. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, "but I don't want my cafe turning into a place for arguments over issues like these." Elon gave a slow, knowing nod, like he had heard this excuse more times than he could count. "Funny," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "I always thought cafes were where people came to talk about things that mattered to them." His gaze swept across the room, landing on every face. No one met his eyes, no one dared to speak. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Jada could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat. And then, Elon began walking, each step measured, unhurried, until he stood directly in front of her. For a brief moment, he simply looked at her. Then, with absolute certainty, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Jada's eyes widened in disbelief as she stared at the business card in her hands. His name was printed clearly on it. An email address. A direct contact number. She swallowed hard. Was this a job offer? Elon watched her carefully, his voice calm but firm. "I need people who stand by their principles. If you're looking for a new opportunity, call me." The entire cafe stood in stunned silence. Frank slowly placed his newspaper down, frowning. "Seems like she got lucky." Elon turned his gaze toward him, eyes cold and sharp. "Maybe it's luck, or maybe she deserves it." Frank pressed his lips together, saying nothing. Jada held onto the card, her mind spinning. She didn't know if she deserved an offer like this. She didn't know if she was qualified for whatever role he had in mind. She didn't know what lay ahead. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget this moment. She turned her gaze back toward the cafe one final time. Mrs. Margaret looked at her with hesitation, as if wanting to say something but choosing to remain silent. Mr. Carl gave a slow nod, neither approving nor disapproving, but acknowledging what had just happened. Frank stood with his arms crossed, his expression still laced with irritation. And Mr. Smith? He remained behind the counter, his face devoid of emotion. No one wished her well. No one told her they were sorry. No one had been willing to stand up for her. But now they all looked at her differently. Jada took a deep breath, gave Elon a small nod, and turned toward the door. As she pulled it open, the cool night air rushed in, sweeping through the cafe like a silent exhale. A gust of wind brushed against her skin, carrying with it a sense of freedom, mixed with a flicker of uncertainty. She didn't know if she should trust this opportunity. She didn't know if she was walking into something bigger than she could handle. But she did know one thing. She would not look back. For the first time in years, she had no idea what was waiting for her. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was in control of her own fate. Jada stepped forward, feeling the ground beneath her feet as if for the first time. The business card in her hand was more than just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of change. One door had closed, another had opened. But did she have the courage to walk through it? She had no idea what lay ahead. She had no way of knowing if working with Elon Musk was the right choice. But one thing was undeniable. She was no longer the same Jada she had been yesterday. She had spoken up when no one else would. She had stood by what she believed in, even when it cost her everything. And though she had lost the job she had once cherished, she had gained something far greater, an opportunity she never could have imagined. Sometimes, standing up for what you believe in comes at a cost. But sometimes, it opens doors you never even knew existed. If you were Jada, what would you have done? Would you be willing to risk everything to stay true to your principles? Or would you choose silence to maintain stability? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that one small decision can completely change the course of your life? If this story made you think, like and share to spread this powerful message to others.